Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. This episode focuses on a famous experiment by brain scientist Benjamin Libet, which seems to show that we have no free will. Our guest is Tim Bayne.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Tim Bayne, professor of philosophy at Monash University. Tim's research focuses on the nature of consciousness, and he's the author of two books, The Unity of Consciousness and Thought, A Very Short Introduction, both published by Oxford University Press. He's also the editor of several other books. Tim's also written several papers on free will, and we'll say more about this project in the next episode, but Tim is also an investigator for the Neurophilosophy of Free Will project. So welcome to the show, Tim. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Sure. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Taylor. So I'm first and foremost a philosopher. I guess I tend to think of myself as a philosopher of consciousness, but I'm interested in a lot of the issues at the intersection between, as it were, pure philosophy and the empirical sciences, cognitive science, neuroscience. And I don't think of myself as a free will person per se. I mean, there's a free will community, but I dabble around the edges. I guess my interest in free will and related issues, I guess it was probably sparked by going to a meeting of the ASSC, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, when I was a grad student. This particular meeting was in London, Ontario, in Canada. And Dan Wegner gave a talk. And Dan, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but he gave a wonderfully entertaining talk. He was a great speaker. He hadn't yet published his book, The Illusion of Conscious Will, but it was that material. And, as the title suggests, he was arguing that conscious will is an illusion. And I didn't buy the line, I didn't buy the arguments, but I was intrigued by what he was saying. And he was drawing relatively heavily on some of the Libit work that we're going to talk about, but also his own work as a social psychologist. And what I thought was particularly intriguing was the dissociation between agency and the structures of agency and the phenomenology of agency. So my way into a lot of these issues, and it's a way in virtue of the fact that I'm sort of interested in consciousness, is think about the phenomenology of agency, the experience of being an agent. Consciousness studies has been dominated by perception. People focus on perception, and within perception, really been dominated by vision. And there's so much more to consciousness than perception. So much more to consciousness, certainly, than vision. And the phenomenology, the experience of being an agent, of acting, the experience of free will, it's always been part of the discussion around free will, but it's not. It's rarely been at the center of debates, and it's often been sidelined. There are a few free will theorists who give it prominence, but many don't really talk about it. And I think for many people, certainly many ordinary folks, the experience of being an agent, experience of freely willing something, is central to how they lock on to the notion. What are we talking about? We're talking about that thing that I experience, or the thing that's revealed to me in experience. So to the extent that I've worked on free will, to the extent that I think of myself as a free will person, it's thinking about those issues. What is the structure of the phenomenology of agency? How is it related to agency itself and its disorders, which I think are particularly revealing and particularly interesting? And what might neuroscience tell us about that? So that's where I've come at things from. And every 5 years or so, I find myself writing a paper on these issues or getting pulled back into them. And the Neurophilosophy of Free Will project, that's headed up by Uri Maus at Chapman, is my latest way of getting pulled back into these issues that you mentioned in your introduction.
Yeah, nice.
Cool. Well, recently, a widely discussed threat to free will from science has come from the Libit experiment. In a previous episode, Robin Waller gave a quick summary of the experiment, but our goal here is to delve deeper. Would you mind telling us who Libit was and what he did in this famous study?
Sure. So Libet was a physiologist He was based at University of California in San Francisco, I believe, and he published um, a paper that has been hugely influential in the a couple of papers, but I guess the original one was '83. And then there was a behavioral and brain sciences follow up that had many, many commentaries. Came out in '85, and that's the whole field of thinking about free will. That sort of the work that's being done by neuroscientists, physiologists, psychologists, philosophers has ever since, I think, struggled to break free of the Libet paradigm. I mean, every talk that you hear now, people say we need to go beyond Libet, we need to talk about new things, and they always start with 3 slides on Libet. Because we're really struggling. Everyone wants to go beyond Libet, but it's the touchstone of this field. So it's been hugely influential. So what Libet did is, and I think he says this in one of the subtitles to one of his papers, he wanted to take an experimental approach to free will. And by that, I think what he meant was not an approach that experimentally works out or experimentally tackles how free will works, what's the mechanisms, but just the whether question. Do we have free will or not? And so there's another whole approach you might take, which is not Libet's approach, which is, we sort of know we have free will in this situation. How does it work? How it works. That's not Libet's approach. I think Libet was very much interested in the whether or not we have it. And his approach is simple in many ways. It's to look at the relative timing of various things. So he got people to carry out a very simple motor action, motor response, sort of flexing their wrist or flexing a finger. And these were self-paced. So at any point within an open-ended period of time, when you felt the urge or the will to flex your wrist, for example, participants were required to do that. And 2 other things happened roughly concurrently with that. One is that the participants had to watch an oscilloscope, so basically a clock face that was rapidly spinning around, and that enabled them to time when they felt the urge to move. So that's what Libet called the W time. He never says, I believe, what W stands for, but I presume it's will. I think it's will, right? When they willed the action, that's the W time. And while that was going on, Libet was recording with electrodes electrical activity in the brain. He was recording what we referred to as the readiness potential. So a slow build-up of electrical potential in the brain, predominantly in the premotor areas, I think it was recording from. And the thought was, to simplify things, Libet basically claimed that if free will exists, then the conscious decision, the act of will, should initiate the brain activity, and then the motor response. And what he found is that the brain activity, the readiness potential, roughly predated the conscious will by about 300 milliseconds. So if 0 is when the motor response begins, the movement of the wrist begins, the W point was roughly, there's a few complications, but roughly 200 milliseconds before 0. So people are aware of their conscious will before the movement starts. But Libet said you can find the signature of brain activity, the readiness potential, another 300 or so, again, there's complications, but roughly 300 milliseconds before the W. And he says, if free will exists, that's the wrong way around. Right? The brain event, the brain is causing as it were, the conscious will, and that's the wrong way around. Now, there's all sorts of assumptions built into that reasoning, but that's basically what he claims, that there's no free will. There's a few complications. I'll just mention one briefly. Libet did think that there's a small window in the 200 milliseconds between the W, between the awareness of the conscious will, the willing, and the start of the motor response. There's a 200 millisecond window, and he thought that you could exercise a kind of veto power in that 200. So that's what he calls the free won't. We don't have free will. We can't consciously It's cute. We can't consciously initiate anything, but we can consciously stop, as it were, veto the action. Now, there's problems with that, but just to be clear on what Libet's own view was, he thinks there's a kind of free will, i.e. free will, that gets in through the back door. Not many people have found that move entirely acceptable, but that's just to get clear on what Libet's own interpretation was.
Right. So he thought that in order to have free will, it'd have to be the case that the brain activity that he was measuring, the readiness potential, as he calls it, would have to come after the W, or at least simultaneous with it. Could you say a little bit more about how he's thinking of free will and why exactly the data, as he's interpreting it, seems to be a problem for free will?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, what could he be thinking? What would you have to be thinking for that argument to fly? And I think the answer is long and complicated. At times, it looks like, and certain commentators have sometimes suggested, he's got to be thinking in terms of dualism. He's got to be adopting a dualistic perspective. He's got to be assuming, or someone who finds the Libet argument compelling, and many people do. It's not just Libet. I mean, this stuff's been hugely influential in the media. Popular science, people just sort of wave their hands, say Libet showed there's no free will.
Right.
Why would you think that's true? One, I think there's two or three things to say. The first is you might be assuming a kind of dualism that whatever causal effect acts of conscious will have, they can't be identified with or realized with or implemented by brain activity. So if that's right, it's not anything about this particular neural activity that's interesting. It's showing that there's some neural activity that's, as it were, causally sufficient for the response. That's enough to blow free will out of the water. I think that thought is quite compelling to many people. Of course, if you're your standard physicalist, you don't have to be a reductive physicalist, right? You don't have to identify acts of conscious will with brain events. You could be a sort of functionalist or a non-reductive physicalist. You say, there's some neural activity underpins it. The full nature of the conscious decision can't be captured by appeal to that neural activity, but there is going to be an underpinning, a physical neural underpinning to any active conscious decision. If that's your view, then you're going to have to find some other story about why the Libet paradigm is compelling. Right. So dualism versus physicalism is one thing that needs to be thought about here.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, which is, I think, independent of dualism versus physicalism, is the idea that the conscious will is itself the initiator of the action. That if you've got a pre-conscious state that is not intrinsically or inherently conscious, and that's what the readiness potential allegedly is, that can't have the properties we associate with free will. Now, why would you think that? Well, good question. Is it something about the relationship between consciousness and control, that if it's not conscious, it's not got the kind of control that you need for free will? Possibly. Another thought, which I think is interesting and compelling, is without consciousness, it's not really mine. So people say, what Libet showed is my brain made me do it. Right? Now, there's one way of thinking about that it sort of assumes or embodies dualism. Right? I mean, if you're a physicalist, I am my brain, or I'm not one thing and my brain's another. My brain realizes me. But there's another way of understanding that phrase, my brain made me do it, which is for an action to be truly mine, as opposed to a response of some part of me, I've got to be consciously involved in it in some way. I think that's the most plausible, compelling, attractive reconstruction of kind of the Libet thought. So at times it looks like dualism is the thing that's being appealed to. At other times it's this claim about the necessity for conscious initiation, whatever that means. People talk about conscious initiation. The phrase itself is a little bit obscure to my ear. Not entirely clear what we mean by it. But I think that's part of what I mean, the sociological factors, people find the Libet argument compelling.
Right.
Philosophers generally don't,
Right.
but everyone else does, and that needs to be explained. I think everyone else thinks, "Whoa, how do you reconcile that with free will?"
Yeah, it sounds kind of like a disappearing agent type of objection, where if it's just like
Right,
an event in my brain that causes my behavior, it's not me, so I shouldn't be the one that's held responsible or
right.
whatever.
That's a really nice way of putting it. That's a nice way of putting it. That's right. Something initiated it, but it's not me. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what you have to believe about the nature of the agent for that to fly is an interesting question,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah,
I mean, if I'm playing tennis and some motor system overlearned motor routine initiates a return that it's too quick for conscious awareness, do we say, "Oh, I didn't, it wasn't my forehand"?
Yeah.
No, I mean Federer doesn't say, "Oh, it wasn't me who returned it." He takes full
Right.
he takes full ownership for that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
There's no disappearing agent there. So you know, there are contexts in which we don't want to identify the agent with the realm of conscious or what's consciously initiated. I think, but maybe there are other contexts where we do. I think that's an open question.
So, are there any other criticisms of the design of the experiment itself that we could talk about now?
Well, I mean, there are there are a lot. I mean, if folks are interested, that 1985 BBS paper, every neuroscientist and their dog gets in on the act and say this problem.
Yeah.
There are a lot. I was once struck by a talk that Patrick Haggard gave, who's done a huge amount of really great work in this area, where he sort of listed about 8 methodological problems with Libet's paradigm, and then made the interesting comment that sort of 4 of them suggest he's overemphasizing the gap. And I'm making this up, but you get the point.
Mm-hmm.
And the other 4 sort of suggest he's probably under, and they sort of cancel each other out, as it were.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm a little bit on the sidelines in terms of the methodological nitty gritty. You've got to, I'm too much of a philosopher to have the time to really get into the methodological details. But that my sense is that people in the field, the general sense is that there's all sorts of problems with the methodology of Libet's work, but the basic finding, give or take, has held up. That there is a gap of roughly 200 milliseconds, and there's, depending on exactly the paradigm, you can get the readiness potential to push out to 1,500 milliseconds before the action, or there's a lot of variation in the readiness potential. But generally speaking, you can get a readiness potential like signal before the W, antedate it by to at least 200 or 300 milliseconds before the reported time of the conscious will, and that's really all you need to get the conscious will, to get the Libet worry, as it were, the Libet argument up and running.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I don't know whether you want to talk about this now or later. Perhaps the game changer in terms of responses to Libet is work that Aaron Sherga's done. Paper came out in 2012, and there's a beautiful summary of it and engagement with the whole readiness potential and the interpretation of the readiness potential. A paper that Aaron and Adina Roski has published just a couple of months ago in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, just called "What is the Readiness Potential?" I think, where Aaron talks about his interpretation, where the ramping up of the readiness potential is basically, this is how I understand it. I would urge readers to take a close look at the paper itself, but on my reading of it, it's basically an artifact of the fact that the signals, you don't pick up the readiness potential on any one trial. This is a point that Alan Mealy made quite a while back, and I hadn't realized it from Libet's work, and I think many people don't. If you've only got a passing acquaintance, you've got to back average the readiness potential from a fixed point. This is a really key issue. So if you're just looking at one participant and recording from their brain and and getting them to monitor their behavior, you're not going to see readiness potential. You've got to take a whole bunch of people. You've got to line up all the EEG data from a single point, which is the initiation. So you record when each of them, voluntarily flex their wrist, and then you line up all the data, and then you look, you average it, and then you look, and then you from that you'll see the readiness potential emerge. But it's invisible on any single trial, basically. And Aaron's really interesting point is the ramping up. There's good reason to think that at least part of that is a methodological artifact of it's the function of the fact that you're averaging from a single point and going backwards. So it doesn't reflect an unconscious decision-making process in the way that Libet thought it was. It's, as it were, kind of an artifact of the way that you're collecting the data. And that I think has really been a game changer in how people think about this stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was going to ask another question about this assumption that the ramping up of the readiness potential is somehow correlated with like an unconscious decision. Some other critics, like you mentioned Al Mealy, I think he says this at one place, they take this assumption to be problematic because you might think of the ramping up of that readiness potential as something like a precursor to a decision, but not itself a unconscious decision. Something like the ramping up of mental activity leading up to maybe the conscious willing or something else that we might identify as a decision. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that way of kind of critiquing this assumption of Libet's.
Right. I mean, I think Al's right on the money. I mean, it relates to the point I was talking about before, which is he really put his finger on the issue, which is, well, there's two steps of Al's argument as I think of it. So one is, it could be a decision. Suppose you want to identify the readiness potential with a mental event. Libet seems to think of it something like a decision, right? That's the point of initiation.
Right.
That's the cause, if one wants to go in for that language. And Al said, look, there's mental antecedents of actions that aren't in any sense their cause. I mean, there's urge. I can have an urge to raise my hand. Yeah. And if I know that at some point within the next 5 minutes, I need to raise my hand, should I do it now? Or now? I probably kind of do have this background urge, right? Because once I've done it, I no longer have to do this thing that I've agreed to do at some point. But we don't think of urges as playing the same functional role as decisions, right? They're not as points of no return, right? You can resist urges. We do it all day, not all day, every day, but it's a commonplace thing to resist. Yes, To resist pretty close.
Sometimes more successful than others.
Sometimes more successful than others, exactly. And so Al said, okay, so suppose it's, we've got two possibilities. It's an urge or it's a decision. How do we know which of those interpretations is to be preferred? Well, one thing you might ask is, do we have instances of the readiness potential? Are there trials on which a readiness potential occurs, but there's no motor action? Right? They would be, as it were, the urge interpretation would be appropriate there because you resist the urge and you don't act. Whereas if it's a decision, you wouldn't, as it were, if it's the cause, the final, what Searle calls an intention in action, right? It's the final decision. It's the thing that's right up against the action. Then you wouldn't expect to find readiness, trials on which there's a readiness potential but no action. And then Al pointed out, well, if you only see the readiness potential by back averaging from actions, from the point at which the action has begun, you can't answer that question because you don't have any trials. You simply don't have any trials in which there's a readiness potential but no action.
Yeah,
right. You've got you're right. Methodologically, that is an unanswerable question. And so that sort of sets the stage as I reconstruct it. And the history is probably not right, but conceptually it makes sense. That sets the stage conceptually for Scherger's work, where not only is that a possibility, but the nice neurocomputational model with a stochastic variability enables you to tell a really plausible story as to how it could be that it's not a decision, right? So I think Mealy's point and Scherger's point. I don't know what the history of interaction is, but they go hand in glove to me, as I think of it. Let me just mention one other thing, which is in the background here. So, as I think of it, Al says, look, we've got a personal level description of agency. We've got urges, decisions, acts of will, and we've got this neurophysiological level. We've got the readiness potential of, and Al's asking, should we think of the readiness potential as identical to or realizing an urge or a decision? There's another point of view, which is those questions should be resisted, or at least we shouldn't expect to find a mapping between events characterized at a personal level and neurophysiological states. There's going to be, in the round, the mind and its activities are in some sense, if we're physicalists, and we might not be, but if we are nothing over and above neural activity. Sure, we can agree with that. No, embracing a kind of supervenience claim, there's no mental difference without a physical difference. But does that mean at the individual level of description, we should look for mappings? I think that's at least an open question, and a certain kind of non-reductive physicalism will say, "Oh, you're not going to find, and you shouldn't expect to find, the bit in the brain that's the urge, the bit in the brain that's the decision." There'll be neural activity that there might be some loose, rough and ready story as to how that maps on, but there's a kind of precision at the level of neuroscience that we just don't have when it comes to describing our mentalized and ordinary folk psychological terms. And I think lots of people just assume that there's going to be a mapping from folk psychological categories, urges, decisions, to the categories of neuroscience. And it's at least questionable whether that assumption is justified, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about several criticisms already of the experiment. One prominent type of criticism that I've heard before is about the type of action that Libet was asking the participants to engage in. Could you explain a little bit about how, we're generalizing from a very specific, like you said, wrist flex to, okay, there's no free will in any of our actions?
Yeah. I think this is, in some sense, the simplest but also most important criticism of Libet. And if there's one thing I would wish that the general public and science writers would get right, is this point. So let's call Libet, the kind of action that Libet studied, a Libet action. Right? It's a simple action, and then nothing rides on it. Absolutely nothing rides on it. Right? Do I flex my wrist now or now? And it's built into the situation that nothing rides on it. So it's sort of the liberty of indifference. Right? There's no reasons, and you structure it such that I could have no possible reason for attempting to do the action now as opposed to now. But obviously, many of our actions and many of the actions we care most about don't exemplify the liberty of indifference. There's all sorts of reasons, and part of the difficulty of being a mature human agent is weighing reasons and trying to interrogate reasons.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the examples one gives in Introduction to Free Will classes, Sartre's young man.
Oh yeah.
Right. Does he join the resistance, or does he stay and look after his elderly mother? I think it is.
Yeah.
Right. He's got reasons for both, and part of what he's struggling with is, what should I do? As which reasons should I act on? Which of the reasons are more weighty? Now, the obvious question, there's a bunch of questions here. One is, let me separate two. One is, which type of action? Let's contrast, just to be extreme, Sartre's case with Libet's case. Which of these scenarios exemplifies free will? Do they both? Neither of them? One of them exemplify free will more than another? I think Libet Well, Libet says the actions I'm studying are paradigms of free will. Now, Adina Roskies has done some nice stuff picking up on this issue very nicely. And she says they are, I think she said, they're best degenerate examples of free will.
Yeah.
And I've got some sympathy with Adina. I think I'm slightly more willing to say they are cases of free will, but I would certainly agree with Adina that they're not the only cases, and I don't think they're paradigms. So I don't want to say they're not, but they're not the paradigmatic cases, I think, and they're not the most interesting. They're not the most important. I think if we were to say with Libet, oh yes, we don't have free will in Libet cases, I'm not sure whether the sky would fall in terms of people who think free will is really important. We could live without a kind of free will for Libet cases, I think. The second issue is not so much the contours of the concept of free will, that the distribution across agency, as it were, of our intuitions about free will, but whether Libet's findings generalize. This is the issue that you were raising, Matt.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's taken me forever to get back to it. And Libet, I think, seems to have assumed or thought it likely that it did generalize, and people have often said that. But we've now got evidence that it doesn't generalize. So there's a great study. Adina's not on it, I don't think, but Uri Maus from Chapman is on it, as is Liad Mudrak from Tel Aviv University, and they did a Libet style study with involving decisions that matter. So subjects were it was a choice between giving money to one charity as opposed to another charity, and they found that you didn't see the characteristic readiness potential. So I think at this stage it's sort of an open question what the differences are between scenarios that exemplify the liberty of indifference, Libet actions, and ordinary actions which are structured by reasons of some kind. But we've at least got some evidence, some pretty solid evidence, I would say, that you can't generalize too quickly from the one to the other.
Yeah.
And what the Mao's study shows, I think, raises really acutely is what we really want to know is how reasons play into action. That's a really interesting thing. Now, there's a whole other body of work in social psychology and suggesting that a lot of human action isn't governed, it's not informed by reason. Reason is a post hoc confabulation.
Yeah.
That you might think is more of a threat to many intuitions surrounding free will than the Libet stuff. That's a separate conversation, I think. But certainly, in terms of the neuroscience of free will, asking what is it for a reason to be embodied in the brain, and what would it take for a neuroscientist to show that reasons are or aren't being appropriately interrogated in decision making? That's a really interesting issue.
Yeah.
Well, we've already talked about some other kind of related studies along the way, but are there any other sort of follow-ups to Libet's original experiment? And you've kind of been offering your own take along the way and providing some criticisms, but what's your overall assessment of what Libet has or hasn't shown?
Sure. Maybe I'll take those issues in reverse order, if that's that's okay, Taylor. Look, I guess I'm not sure that Libet's shown a whole lot, but he's raised a whole bunch of really interesting questions. So let me pull back a little bit and identify two takeaways from the Libet industry, as it were. One is, for me, he raises the question: so, what would it take for a neuroscientist, for a physiologist, to put pressure on our intuitive conception of free will? Or what would it take to show that we do have free will? Let's put it another way. So a lot of philosophers don't think the Libet results show a whole lot. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now tell us what you cook up what kind of finding, and I think there's a useful place for sort of armchair neuroscience, as it were, which is to say, suppose that the neuroscience turned out this way. Suppose we had this finding. Would that show that we do have free will? Would that show that we don't? Suppose it turned out this way. And it might be very hard to do the experiments. It might be impossible. But and I don't think there's a clear answer to that question. I don't think that the literature, as it were, I don't think the community have a unified answer. I think there's a range of answers where some people would say it's sort of immaterial of what the neuroscience shows. I mean, if neuroscience showed that we were, robots controlled by Martians, then maybe I guess it shows we don't have free will. But anything short of that, anything that's actually neuroscience is realistically going to tell us, is consistent with our because our pre-theoretical conception of free will doesn't make claims about the implementation. That would be a sort of if you like, a Dennettian kind of position on these things. At the other end of the spectrum would be a view which says, no, our ordinary conception of free will makes a lot of claims about the order in which things happen, the relative importance of reasoning or consciousness, capacity to inhibit oneself, self-control. And we have to have a story on which those things are in place and in place in the right order. And if it turns out that they're not in place, in the right order, then some part of our pre-theoretical conception is imperial. But as it were, you need a model of what the folk psychological commitments are to then say, oh, neuroscience could undermine it thus and so. This finding would undermine it, this finding wouldn't. And I don't think we yet have a model. In some sense, that's what various accounts of free will are trying to do, but they're not often developed with that level of specificity in mind.
Yeah.
In part because the concepts they appeal to are very high-level concepts. They're not concepts that neuroscientists use, right? So you need a translation manual, as it were, right? And that's what we don't have and we don't struggle with. So one of the takeaways, I think, is it throws up this really interesting philosophical question, which ties in with the issue of an experimental philosophy about trying to get clear on the folk notion of free will. So people like Eddie Namias and others, Sean Nichols, trying to get clear on what the, are we pre-theoretical, committed to libertarianism or compatibilism, or some of us are libertarians, some of us compatibilists, right? So that's one thing I think the Libit experiment has given us. That's one of the legacies. The other legacy is a sociological one, that it's forced neuroscientists and philosophers interested in these things to work together and talk together. And it's a tricky conversation because we have different languages and different backgrounds. But it's a productive one, and it's a useful one. And I think there aren't that many. There are some, but there aren't that many areas of cognitive science where you've got this real close collaboration, this community of people who actually don't just read each other's work. Well, on good days, we read each other's work, but also collaborate. Co-author papers, right?
Yeah.
I mentioned that paper on the readiness potential that's just come out in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. Collaboration between Aaron Scherger and Adina Roskis, and Walter Synod Armstrong's collaborated with various people here, and Patrick Haggard and Uri Maus and Gideon Yaffe, and so there's a bunch of people working together, and I think had Libet not existed, I don't think we would now be in this interdisciplinary space, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So that's part of the legacy. Just so turning to the question about kind of new developments and new paradigms, let me mention a study that I think is really interesting. It's not a Libet study per se, but if you're interested in Libet studies, I think you'll be interested in this one. It's by Emily Casper. It came out a few years ago. She's a psychologist in Brussels, the Free University in Brussels, and was working with Axel Clearmans and Patrick Haggard on this study. And what they used, I need to explain a little bit of the background here. They used a finding that Patrick Haggard has discovered and worked with, which is called intentional binding. That when you press a button, for example, perform an action, and you're asked to judge the temporal distance between your button press and the effect. So if it sounds a buzzer, for example, when it's a self-generated action, a voluntary action, there's a sort of temporal compression, and so you underestimate the gap between when you press the button and the sound that you produce. And when it's passive, when it's someone else controlling your hand, for example, and using your hand to press the button, so when it's not experienced as a voluntary action, you don't get that temporal compression. So basically, it's an implicit marker of a kind of sense of agency, and it's called intentional binding. So the intentional action is meant to bind together, bring together the cause, your button press, and the effect.
So it's the subject's perception of the time gap that's different.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Subject perception of the time gap that's different. Thanks, you. I didn't do a great job of explaining that, but that's the key thing, right? Intentional binding, and it's meant to be sort of a physiological marker of a sense of agency, of a sense of I did this, as opposed to I didn't do it. So that sort of background that had been established, had been replicated. And what Casper did, what Emily Casper did, was look at coercion. Does does the social context of your action modulate that? So they had a study, and the details it's a bit complicated, but I'll try and give you the nuts and bolts, which is they had participants. They split participants into two groups, agents and victims, as it were, and then they swapped around at halftime. And the agents were either coerced to deliver a shock, a small pain, to the victims, and coerced by the experimenter standing next to them, looking at them, saying, "You have to do this on this trial. This is a trial, shock trial," or to give them a small financial penalty, right? Remove, I think, 5 pence from the amount of money they were going to get. So that was the coercion trials, and the free will trials was the experimenter didn't tell them what they had to do. They said, this, if you want, you can shock them, but you don't have to shock them. And the finding was that when you were on the coercion trial, intentional binding wasn't present. So participants also had to, in addition to deciding whether or not to shock, the shock was delivered by a button press, and they had to estimate the time between the button press and the effect. There was an effect, right? So they also had to do an intentional binding paradigm at the same time. So the takeaway is, when you're coerced, when you're in a social context where someone's telling you what to do, it looks like the reports that people say, I didn't feel like it was up to me. There's a kind of a physiological marker that seems to validate that kind of self-report. So in the background, you've got a kind of Milgram-esque, Nuremberg trial kind of thing that, I was just following orders. And it looks like physiologically, it looks like some of the structure of agency looks a bit different when you're, as it were, following orders, as opposed to doing it of your own free will. It's not a Libet paradigm, but I think it's interesting thinking about the social context of action and the experience of being an agent. So that's a nice study I thought I'd mention.
Nice.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Before we move on to the wrapping up, I had a question, and I'm not sure if this is a stupid question or not, so I was going to wait till the end. When you were talking about where dualism plays into the Libet experiments and whether the experiments show that this kind of dualistic picture of free will is false or wrong. is I'm not as familiar with different dualist accounts, but could they say something like the mind or soul or whatever they have as their other part of the dualism um, causes the decision, and then you become consciously aware, like they separate consciousness from your soul or whatever. Does that even make sense?
Sure, I think, yeah, well, I think it makes sense. I mean, for my money, part of the challenge with dualism is it doesn't come with a whole lot of rules
Yeah.
attached to it. I mean, is it a rule that if you're a dualist, all mental activity has to be conscious? Is it a rule that decisions have to be conscious? Is it a rule that the temporal profile of a decision, or I guess, yeah, I mean, souls are not, I guess they're not spatially well, they're not extended, I guess, on the classical dualist picture, but they're temporally located. Could you have a decision that's temporally extended where the second half is conscious, but the first half is unconscious, but it's still, as it were, the whole thing is decision? Yeah, I don't see why not. I don't think it's. I think there's an intuition that many people have that for dualists, all mental activity has to be conscious, and so maybe Descartes thought that. I think there's a passage where he says something along those lines, I believe, but I don't see why a dualist has to be committed to that at all. Yeah, that's right. So even if you're assuming dualism, it's not obvious that the Libet paradigm. There's moves you can make.
Yeah.
Which is why I think that's an excellent point, and sort of it reinforces the point I made, which is that at first sight, a lot of the love for Libet seems to presuppose a kind of dualist interpretation of agency. But when you really think about it, I think it's not dualism that's doing the work. It's assumptions about the role that consciousness and conscious initiation has to be playing in voluntary agency. If it's not consciously initiated, an action's not free. And that assumption is orthogonal, I think, to any assumptions about dualism or physical. So that's really the heart of the beast. It's a great experiment for trying to work out what one needs to embrace in order for certain interpretations to fly. It's a great, there's so much of the philosophical literature I think is quite rich because a lot of people disagree that it shows what Libet thought it showed, but they disagree for different reasons and in different ways, right? Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit like the causal exclusion problem for mental causation, if you guys are familiar with that, where most people think it doesn't work, but there's a lot of different accounts of why it doesn't work.
Right.
And that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If Libet didn't exist, we'd have to invent him.
Right. Yeah. I'm so glad you put that spin on it in this interview, because it was, I mean, as I was thinking it up, I was like, we're just kind of beating up on Libet here, but I like the fact that it has generated so much good work.
And I mean, there are disciplines where criticism is perceived negatively, and but in philosophical circles, it's kind of a badge of honor to be beaten up on. Right. People are talking about your work. That's great.
If your argument was that bad, everyone would ignore you. So where do you predict that there will be interesting developments or areas of science do you think will be most fruitful for philosophers interested in free will to explore?
Well, I mentioned one issue a while back in passing, which is this question of how reasons play into things, where and how they enter, how to think about reasons within the framework of neuroscience. So that's one thing that's, I think, bubbling away. It's hard. The other thing which I'd like to mention, and I know, Matt, do you have kids? I know Taylor's got kids.
I do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's just me, but I find it puzzling how little developmental psychology enters into these issues.
Yeah.
I mean, no one thinks that the neonate has full free will potential.
Right.
If you're a free will realist rather, as you think there's such a thing, then you think at some point you get it.
Right.
What's the story? Right? How does that
Yes.
how does free will emerge
Mhm.
from its absence? Now, maybe there's a whole literature out there that I'm completely unaware of. That's entirely possible. But I don't see a lot of engagement with developmental psychology and people in the free will world, or people who are interested in free will.
Right.
Yeah. My daughter one time came up to me and said, sometimes I think that I'm just a puppet and God moves me around.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, and she's not, but in some sense, well, I don't know if she was ever a puppet, but she didn't have autonomous agency at
Right.
some point.
Right.
Right. Now, it seems hard to believe that transition is instantaneous. You wake up one day and bang, she's got it. That seems, maybe there are accounts of free will where that you're committed to that, but that seems unlikely. Certainly no
Right.
compatibilist is going to think that.
Yeah.
So, look, if I was starting my career, I don't know, maybe this is a terrible piece of advice, but if I was starting and looking for a research project, you could do worse than trying to see what we might learn from developmental psychology about the ontogenesis of autonomous action.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let me just throw that out there for people looking for a PhD project or something. I don't know.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, so look, there's so many aspects of it. Yeah, and the social context. Like Emily Casper's stuff, I think is interesting on the difference that social context makes to. Well, and her focus is the experience of being an agent, experience of authorship, of owning, of being responsible for something. And there's an open question about the implications of that for actually being responsible for something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to collapse those two things, but this is a real interesting philosophical question: to what degree should attributions of responsibility track feelings of responsibility, the first person agency, first person dimension of agency?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, this has all been great. Thanks so much for joining us, Tim. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, I was hoping you weren't going to say that, Taylor. Ask me that. I'm terrible. I don't really have a functioning web page that certainly not one that I'm proud of. I guess I've got a Google Scholar page. There's stuff there. I mean, if I've got a chance to plug one thing, I will plug. I've got a textbook, Philosophy of Mind textbook, coming out later this year with Routledge, and there's a chapter on mental causation, and for philosophers of mind, mental causation is pretty much, for the most part, an armchair discipline. People focus on Jaegwon Kim's what's called the causal exclusion argument and worries about dualism. But there's a section in that chapter on the Libit stuff where I talk a little bit about Libit in the context of more general challenges to the possibility of mental causation. So. Yeah, if folks are looking for something along those lines, if you feel like you need a refresher in the fundamentals and philosophy of mind, that's there. That'll be out in a bit.
Cool. Yeah, we'll make sure to put that in the show notes. Thanks again, Tim. In our next episode, we'll talk about the role of neuroscience in the free will debate and how philosophers and brain scientists can collaborate to make progress in this debate. Our guest will be brain scientist Uri Maus, assistant professor of computational neuroscience and psychology at Chapman University.
Thanks, guys.